You want to hop into it? The Subcommittee on Intelligence and Counterterrorism will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to receive testimony on tackling human trafficking, assessing federal, state, and local information sharing efforts. Before I pass this off to Ranking Member Walker, first of all, thank you for being so hospitable to this New Yorker. If I may just take a point of privilege and say it has been an incredible honor to serve with Ranking Member Walker. You all have, I believe, one of, if not the best members of Congress representing you. Someone I learned from, someone it is a great privilege and honor to work with, and I think we're certainly making the country a better place. So thank you for the great privilege of allowing him to keep on coming back. And with that, sir, I'll recognize you for the opening statement, as this is your home territory.
Thank you, Chairman Rose. We may have to get you a little barbecue today before we get back to D.C. I don't know how New Yorkers do barbecue, but we've got a couple ways we do it in North Carolina here. But it is a privilege to work with you in getting to know you the last couple of years. Just your heart to get to really the bottom line of these kinds of issues, and a lot of experience coming from New York, specifically in this area. And appreciate the opportunity to work. Appreciate the opportunity to have you here in New York. On behalf of my fellow North Carolinians, I would like to welcome all of you today, as well as the other members of the Subcommittee on Intelligence and Counterterrorism to my home state. I would also like to thank the chairman for agreeing to hold this important hearing on human trafficking. I believe this is the first federal hearing since 1921 here in central North Carolina. As you all know, human trafficking is a despicable crime that continues to plague the nation. Before I get into the numbers, I also wanted to take just a moment and acknowledge the incredible work of our armed services in taking out someone who certainly was no stranger to human trafficking, and that was al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS. Applaud certainly the administration and specifically the great men and women on special forces and other really other servicemen and women who support that to really make a huge difference to eradicate such beings from the planet. In human trafficking, let's look at a couple numbers here. Since 2018, or in 2018, there were 10,949 human trafficking cases that were reported through the national hotline. Trafficking occurs in every state across the country. The vast majority relate to sex trafficking, and the victims and women are girls. Sadly, human trafficking is one of the fastest growing crimes in the United States. Our major highway system, our agriculture economy, and a growing number of criminal gangs have increased the prevalence of human trafficking within North Carolina, with some cases reported even in our district. Some things that I'm sure that Sheriff Sam Page from Rockingham County here today with us can testify. Last year, 287 cases of human trafficking were reported through the hotline in North Carolina, ranking the state 10th in the nation. This is a fraction of the cases reported in California, Texas, Florida, and elsewhere, largely due to the efforts made by stakeholders across the state to coordinate efforts, develop training, and partner with victim services providers. And I will tell you, there's some wonderful ladies on the back, not the back row, but sitting back there, that we have worked on several different statewide occasions that are doing incredible work, not just on state-sponsored thing, but a lot of the nonprofits that really make a difference in the lives. Certainly much more needs to be done to combat this activity, and I'm proud that today's hearing can highlight the important work that is going on across North Carolina. Several state laws have been enacted, which is good, including the permanent creation of the Human Trafficking Commission, which is making annual recommendations to the state legislature on additional authorities, and is working with the State Bureau of Investigation to develop a statewide training program and best practices for law enforcement. I have made combating human trafficking a priority in my office for the very first day. I was proud to be the first freshman of the 114th class to pass a bill through the House. This bill, the Human Trafficking Detection Act of 2015, works to train and inform DHS personnel to do better in detecting and intercepting human trafficking traffickers as well as their victims. Specific to their professional roles, as well as the making and the training curricula available to all state, local, and private sector partners. I am interested in the hearing from our witnesses today. about how the implementation of this law has assisted in the cooperation with all levels of government in their efforts. However, as legislators, we know there is much more that needs to be done. We must continue to work in a bipartisan fashion to solve the complex problems related to human trafficking and ensure those on the front lines have the necessary tools that they need. From talking with victims, advocacy groups, law enforcement, and government agencies across the state, there is no doubt there is a need and a desire for more coordination, training, public awareness, and victim services. I look forward to hearing from our distinguished panel today and learning about how Congress can even further assist their ongoing efforts to combat these international afflictions. This problem is bigger than any one jurisdiction's resources. Again, I want to thank Chairman Rose and Ms. Jackson-Lee for joining us today. I think Ms. Jackson-Lee may not be here. We're waiting on that, but for this important hearing. I also want to express my sincere appreciation for the witnesses, both for appearing here today and for the work that you do every day. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ranking Member Walker. Before I pass it back to you, just to introduce the witnesses, I'd like to just certainly point to a few pieces of legislation I think are of critical importance. One is sponsored by my fellow New Yorker, Representative Carolyn Maloney, the Business Supply Chain Transparency on Trafficking and Slavery Act. It would force large corporations, any company that makes $100 million or more a year, to tell Americans every year what measures the company has taken to identify and address conditions of forced labor, slavery, human trafficking, and child labor. But beyond that, today I'm eager to hear from the witnesses as to how we can provide a whole of government, a whole of society approach to tackling this incredibly difficult, incredibly complex problem that produces untold levels of sorrow and misery. And I believe communities across the country, I do not think that there's any community in the United States of America that is not in some way, shape, or form dealing with this problem. And then in addition, I'm also interested to hear from our witnesses today how we can use the tools of law enforcement available to us, but also how we can use the public health and social service-based tools available to us as well to not only address this problem and the consequences of it, but to also prevent it from arising in the first place. So with that, Ranking Member, I'll pass it back to you again to introduce this exceptional panel of witnesses.
Thank you, Chairman Rose. I appreciate the courtesy of allowing me to introduce this impressive panel who collectively, I think together, we added up, has over 100 years of public service. So we thank you for each of you for that. First, we will hear from Ms. Christine Shaw Long. Ms. Long serves as the Executive Director of the North Carolina Human Trafficking Commission for the North Carolina Judicial Branch. She previously worked and spent 15 years with the Salvation Army of Wake County as the Director of Social Ministries. She also served 4 years on the North Carolina Human Trafficking Commission and on the Salvation Army's North American Anti-Human Trafficking Council. In 2017, she was presented with the National Salvation Army Excellence in Social Work Award. Ms. Long, thank you for your years of dedicated service to human trafficking victims. Secondly, we will hear from Mr. Ronnie Martinez. Mr. Martinez is the Special Agent in charge of the Charlotte Field Office for Homeland Security Investigations within the Department of Homeland Security. Mr. Martinez spent over 27 years of law enforcement, experience. Mr. Martinez has also held several leadership positions within HSI, including Missouri, Washington, and California. Mr. Martinez began his law enforcement career in 1992 with the U.S. Customs Service and served our country in the United States Navy from 1985 to 1989. Thank you for your service, Mr. Martinez, and being here today. Our third witness is Mr. Carl Wall, the Special Agent in charge of the Human Trafficking Unit for the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigations. Special Agent in charge Wall has worked in numerous local law enforcement positions during his 26-year career. His prior positions include serving as a Wake County Deputy Sheriff, North Carolina SBI drug agent, and a DEA task force officer and special agent in charge for the SBI training session. It's a lot of initials there, but I think we've got them covered here. Since 2018, Special Agent Wall has been standing up for the SBI's first human trafficking unit. I appreciate your participation today. Our final witness today is Colonel Andre Azelton. Colonel Azelton is the Chief Deputy at the Randolph County Sheriff's Office. She is a 24-year law enforcement veteran, including 10 years as a detective. She has worked in both Randolph and Alamance County. I think from what I heard last time that Randolph stole you back from Alamance County, but maybe not get into that today. But Colonel Azelton served as a lead homicide investigator in Randolph County and specialized as a human trafficking investigator in Alamance County before returning to Randolph County as the first female chief deputy. Thank you all for appearing here today. I look forward to your testimony and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I would also just like to point out how absolutely beautiful this building is. They don't build stuff like this in New York anymore. So without objection, the witness's full statements will be inserted in the record. I now ask each witness to summarize his or her statement for 5 minutes, beginning with Ms. Christine Shaw Long.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Rose, Ranking Member Walker. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today on this critically important topic. It is an honor to speak on behalf of the many dedicated professionals appointed to the North Carolina Human Trafficking Commission. I currently serve as the executive director and only staff for the commission. Our commission was created by the North Carolina General Assembly in 2012 and was reconfigured in 2013 during the passage of our Safe Harbor Law. The commission consists of 12 appointed members and 3 ex officio judicial seats. Of the 12 voting members, 4 are appointed by the governor, 4 by the North Carolina Speaker of the House of Representatives, and 4 by the North Carolina President pro tempore of the Senate. The statutory charge of the commission is summarized as to apply for and receive funding on behalf of the state, to fund and facilitate research, to assist in creating measurement, assessment, and accountability mechanisms, to inform and educate law enforcement personnel, social service providers, and the general public, to suggest new policies, procedures, legislation, and to assist in developing regional response teams or coordinated efforts, and to identify gaps and recommend solutions. So since 2014, the Commission has participated in several state, regional, and national roundtables or compendiums. In addition, we have also invited regional response programs and providers from the mountains to the coast to share trends they are seeing as well as their program strengths and needs. These experts and many others have given us tremendous insight into gaps across the state and ways to address those gaps. Additionally, state and national experts as well as survivors have provided key information and advice for potential changes. Informed by these stakeholders, the Human Trafficking Commission has launched efforts, partnerships, and projects to make steps towards fulfilling our statutory charge. Some of our successes have been conducting a statewide multidisciplinary symposium annually for the past 3 years, distribution of $1.35 million in direct service grants through a one-time state appropriation, mandatory posting of awareness posters in 19,000 locations across the state, and multiple legislative actions that strengthen our laws or create remedies for victims. Although colleagues beside me today will add much more detail regarding the trends being seen across North Carolina, I can tell you that our state continues to see cases of both sex and labor trafficking crossing all demographic lines. Stories from steadfast providers in the field continue to indicate numerous industries in which cases are being identified, and the opioid epidemic continues to further complicate case management and outreach efforts. While working in the field of human trafficking can be exhausting, I can also speak to how inspirational it is to have dedicated law enforcement, service providers, and community members working alongside each other daily. I would like to highlight 2 of the collaborations seen within the state. These examples include federal, state, and local levels all working in tandem. First, the process of drafting a statewide human trafficking resource directory has demonstrated to us that there's roughly 24 multidisciplinary regional response programs, task forces on a local level, or local coalitions working across the state. These are groups of both government and non-government that are either providing 24/7 response to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, are coordinating providers in order to ensure wraparound services, or are strategically planning action in areas of their community. A second partnership example is the North Carolina Coalition Against Human Trafficking, or NCCAT as we call it. In its original grassroots form, this organization consisted of committed advocates, law enforcement, and service providers, meeting regularly as an informal membership. These professionals initiated projects aimed at building awareness and response across the state in the earlier days. The collective impact model of NCCAT was monumental in the establishment of the Human Trafficking Commission, and NCCAT holds a seat on the commission. Other statewide projects, research, and grants have also included the commission and NCCAT as part of their advisory committees, which then continues to enhance the collective impact at both a macro and a micro level in the state. As you know all too well, large issues such as this one are met with many obstacles. It seems prudent to share some of those challenges facing North Carolina. One main challenge is with statewide mobilization and action is funding. The commission is currently staffed with a state appropriation that ends before the fiscal year closes. Not only does the commission need reoccurring funding to continue progress towards its statutory charge, but our state desperately needs a state-funded task force to ensure cases are taken from initial identification to proper and full victim service provision, and finally to prosecution of the trafficker. Furthermore, we also believe that it is critical to address prevention efforts and prioritize those in funding as well. As with many states, another issue facing us is lack of comprehensive services throughout the state. While we have a few NGOs operating with federal or state funding, there are still many, many gaps in service provision, such as emergency and transitional housing. In addition, expansion of some services and development of additional specialties, such as alternative therapies, is a critical piece in the puzzle. So in summation, human trafficking is sometimes referred to as a public health, a social justice, human rights, and a public safety issue. North Carolina recognizes that it will take everyone working together to end this horrific crime. It is vital that we continue these partnerships and collaborations. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. We appreciate your interest and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
You want to introduce him? You can go ahead. Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Mr. Ronnie Martinez to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Rose. Good morning, Chairman Rose, Ranking Member Walker. It's an honor to be here to represent Homeland Security Investigations, HSI. I can attest to HSI's continued commitment to identifying and assisting human trafficking victims and bringing traffickers to justice. I am particularly pleased to be here as the special agent in charge of the new HSI Charlotte office. On average, HSI conducts 1,000 human trafficking investigations annually. HSI identifies and assists hundreds of victims and conducts extensive local outreach and training to generate leads. However, we do not and cannot do this important work alone. HSI participates in more than 120 human trafficking task forces consisting of federal, state, and local law enforcement, as well as non-governmental victim service providers. In North Carolina specifically, HSI participates in 3 task forces in Charlotte, Winston-Salem, and Raleigh. These covering the state's 3 federal judicial districts. These task forces have been extremely successful in identifying and dismantling human trafficking networks. Together with our law enforcement partners, we have increased arrests, indictments, prosecutions of traffickers in North Carolina and abroad. Together with our NGO partners, human trafficking victims have received critical and comprehensive social services. HSI's human trafficking mission is twofold. 1, to proactively identify cross-border trafficking organizations and minimize the risk they pose to national security and public safety. And 2, to employ a victim-centered approach whereby equal value is placed on the identification and stabilization of victims, as well as the investigation and prosecution of traffickers. Law enforcement as a whole is much better at identifying and tackling sex trafficking. However, labor trafficking is just as insidious as sex trafficking, but much harder for us to find. For decades now, HSI has been seeing the same types of cases involving agriculture, construction, domestic work, restaurants, and massage parlors, essentially jobs with low pay and fewer legal protections in the underground economy and in the service industry. When I recently assumed the duty of Special Agent in Charge for North and South Carolina, I learned about a particularly horrendous HSI investigation in North Carolina from 2012. In 2012, a sex trafficker named Shahid Hassan Muslim forced a 16-year-old to have sex with as many as 12 men per day. After almost a year, she escaped, but in revenge, Muslim tracked her down and held her captive for days while physically assaulting her. This was also a threat to 5 other young women Muslim was trafficking that the same would happen to them if they had tried to leave him. A total of 18 minors and young women, both United States citizens and foreign nationals, were identified as victims in this joint investigation by HSI, FBI, and the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. I chose to illustrate this case today for a few reasons. First, there are trafficking cases that involve the recruiting and smuggling of victims into the United States for the purposes of their exploitation. However, Muslim's case is one of many where his victims were both United States citizens and were longtime lawfully present immigrants in our communities. Traffickers will exploit anyone out of greed. Second, criminals, including sex traffickers, are becoming increasingly savvy to use technology to conduct and conceal their insidious activities. Muslim was prolific in his use in online advertising, social media for recruitment, and online companies to conceal his movements. HSI is committed to staying on pace with cybercrime investigative strategies. And third, HSI provides victims with an array of referrals for comprehensive services. As a result, one of the victims now is on a pathway to United States citizenship. Another victim recently graduated from college, and her graduation was attended by the case agent and a social worker. We have seen time and time again that law enforcement officers who work with victim assistance personnel are more stable victim witnesses and stronger investigations. More importantly, the victims of these nefarious crimes have statistically better chances to rebuild their lives. I want to thank you for highlighting human trafficking and law enforcement efforts, and I thank you for this opportunity to appear before you today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Mr. Caldwell to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Mr. Wall, I hate to interrupt you there, but I want to make sure that your mic is working. Is that something that we can check, make sure if that doesn't, I know Manny, that's not. Okay, I think we're on. Just maybe speak as much as you can to the mic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
My name is Carl Wall, and I'm the Special Agent in charge of North Carolina State Investigation Human Trafficking Unit. For more than 26 years, I've had the honor of serving North Carolina as a law enforcement officer, and the last 21 as a special agent with the SBI. In 2017, the North Carolina General Assembly gave the SBI original jurisdiction in human trafficking. In 2018, the SBI began efforts to establish a unit to combat human trafficking in North Carolina. In July of that year, I was assigned of the SAC of the Human Trafficking Unit. My goals were to provide training, both basic and advanced, to identify and support and rescue victims, and identify and bring to justice traffickers, and also to coordinate with local and federal law enforcement. Currently, I'm the only full-time human investigation or human trafficking agent within our agency. The SBI has lobbied for more agents with the General Assembly. In our pending state budget, the General Assembly has has a designated funds for 8 full-time human trafficking agents. If our governor signs the budget, we'll have a full-time unit to serve the citizens of North Carolina. When I began this position, I had no experience or prior knowledge of human trafficking. I attended every training and conference I could find to learn what human trafficking looks like, especially in our state of North Carolina. I've also learned from other agencies, including the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, as to what their states do to combat human trafficking. Many of these agencies exceed North Carolina in resource allocated to combat human trafficking, the understanding of the crime, and the structure of the response. Many have protocols and excellent working relationships between federal and state and local agencies, to include non-governmental organizations, to make human trafficking cases seamless in their investigations and response to victims. In 2017, as you pointed out, Ranking Member, North Carolina was ranked from the Polaris Project as being 8th in the nation with human trafficking tips reported. That year in 2017, we had 221 cases reported. 149 of them sex-related, 51 of them labor-related. And in 2018, there were 287 tips reported, 192 of them related to sex, 54 related to labor, which ranked us 10th in the nation. Although these reports appear to be low, these are just tips reported to Polaris, which were agreed to be shared with law enforcement. I've learned through active communication with local service providers, a safe place in Wilmington, North Carolina, that they alone had serviced over 190 victims in 2018. So what is the accurate data? It's my belief that the actual numbers are much higher than Polaris reports. And as we as a state simply don't know the real number of victims in North Carolina, we need to find out. The SBI's intelligence analyst, Ashley Burke, was asked to evaluate the number of sex-related advertisements on the internet specific to North Carolina. On just one website, Skip the Games, we discovered that in 2018, there were over 400,000 ads specific to North Carolina. It's evident that North Carolina, like other states, has a human trafficking issue, and law enforcement is behind in effectively combating it. To date, the Fayetteville Police Department is the only one agency that has a full-time human trafficking unit in the state. They have four full-time working human trafficking, or officers working human trafficking cases, and have been extremely successful. North Carolina is unique as we're still educating officers, chiefs, and sheriffs that human trafficking exists, and it's our mission at the SBI to educate and assist them in coordinating investigations and rescuing victims. At a recent Police Executive Research Forum, the PERF Roundtable, I explained that not everyone in North Carolina recognizes human trafficking and that the victims are truly victims and not suspects in a prostitution case. I have found that the best way to relate to local law enforcement's misunderstanding of human trafficking is to explain to them from my point of view as a previous drug investigator. Traffickers are like drug dealers. They're business people. Rather than selling narcotics, their commodity is another human being. Sadly, people are a commodity that they do not have to replenish. Their product doesn't go away. When they sell it, they can profit over and over. During classes that we teach all over the state, we make sure to show human trafficking is not just in our most populated areas, as some assume, but it's everywhere. Attached is attachment number 2 is a map of the state of North Carolina that shows how many ads are specific to each selected city. Even rural communities in North Carolina are not immune from this heinous crime. When I hear someone say the victim could leave or run at any time they wanted, they're not a victim. I explain to them I've yet to have a victim tell me that they chose to be a prostitute when they grew up. It doesn't happen. These are victims controlled by force, fraud, coercion from the traffickers. Over the past 15 months, the SBI has conducted over 20 trainings covering 15 counties, with more scheduled. In the 15 months, the SBI has gone from conducting approximately 18 human trafficking investigations to having opened 61 cases to date. We have 14 SBI agents who have volunteered to have a collateral duty in addition to their regular duty to investigate human trafficking. And of course, this comes as a secondary duty only to their original assignments. As the SBI moves forward in establishing a full-time human trafficking unit, we continue to train, educate, and conduct proactive investigations. We do this in collaboration and partnerships with local and federal agencies. In the past 15 months, the SBI has conducted 10 proactive operations in which we have encountered over 45 victims of human trafficking. With our partnerships and collaborations, we've been able to offer these victims services to get them out of their current situation. And we've identified and began to identify and investigate the traffickers and bring them to justice. Partnerships and collaboration is the only way you can investigate this crime. It's like no other. With law enforcement, we must work together with our NGOs to conduct a successful investigation. It's the only crime that law enforcement needs and relies on others for a successful case. When the SBI began this unit in 2018, the first thing I did was personally go and visit our federal partners in each area of responsibility. I met with the RAC of each Homeland Security Investigations Office and explained the SBI's mission and what our goals are. Each office has been more than helpful in assisting the SBI's mission. I've also met and described our mission to each of the RAC offices with the FBI within North Carolina. They too have been very supportive and inclusive. The federal agencies have been imperative in the creation and the success of the SBI's current mission. In each of our human trafficking outreach operations and in most of our investigations, there's been a positive interaction with federal and local law enforcement. We're here to support each other with the same goals of supporting victims and helping them get out of the life and bring to justice the traffickers. This partnership is key. We must all share our data and our information because the traffickers know no boundaries. We must work hand in hand with our NGO partners and make sure to include them as we move forward in this effort to end human trafficking. On average, it takes 6 encounters with law enforcement and NGOs to get a victim to understand that their normal is not normal and to show them a better way without a trafficker. So we all must work diligently and continuously together to make a difference in North Carolina. As we move forward with a full-time human trafficking unit for the SBI, I'm proud to lead the charge for our agency. I'm proud to have partners such as HSI and FBI and our local law enforcement as we tackle this hideous crime. In my 26+ years in law enforcement, I have seen many gruesome crimes. I've dealt with murderers, rapists, ruthless narcotic organizations, but until this assignment, I'd never seen the violence, both physical and mental, the sickness, and the controlling that a trafficker has over a victim. A victim is another human being. A victim has the potential to be successful, proactive person to society, and humanity has been taken away by someone else. The crime of human trafficking has always existed in some form. We must turn our lens of our views as to what it is, where it is, and how we go about changing it. No longer should we look at these individuals as choosing to sell themselves for sex. They're victims of human trafficking. In closing, I'm proud to be the one to hopefully make a change in human trafficking in North Carolina. I hope in my final years of law enforcement, we can see the success that the SBI and all the partners hope for. I hope to have a full-time unit that makes a huge impact on this crime. Our number of reported victims will rise, and we want those numbers to rise. That will show how serious the issue we have. If the numbers rise, then we know the public, law enforcement, and everyone is seeing the crime for what it really is and not being ignored or misidentified. Thank you to the members of the committee for allowing me to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Colonel Andrea Aselton to summarize her statement for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Max Rose and Ranking Member Walker. It is both an honor and a privilege to testify before you today on this incredibly important issue on behalf of Sheriff Greg Seabolt and the many dedicated professionals at the Randolph County Sheriff's Office. I am Colonel Andrea Aselton, Chief Deputy at the Randolph County Sheriff's Office. I am a 24-year 24-year law enforcement veteran with 10 years of investigative experience. I wish I were still 24. In 2016, I left Randolph County Sheriff's Office and went to work as a Special Victims Unit detective in Alamance County. I was assigned Sheriff Terry Johnson to work human trafficking cases there. At that time, I had absolutely no experience or training and very little knowledge about human trafficking. However, I was quickly connected to the Alamance Anti-Human Trafficking Advocacy Council, comprised of detectives from local municipalities, assistant district attorneys, an SBI agent, and a representative from the Alamance for Freedom, an NGO focused on the advocacy for human trafficking victims. Through that council, I received knowledge and training that helped me recognize and understand my role in the process necessary to investigate human trafficking and the resources available to trafficking victims. I am by no means an expert in human trafficking investigations. However, I can testify to the fact that these investigations are complex, and there are many forms of human trafficking that I had never before realized were in our communities. I can also testify that these investigations are beyond the existing expertise or experience of most local agencies in North Carolina without the assistance of the State Bureau of Investigations and/or Homeland Security Investigations, and impossible without the collaboration from the District Attorney's Office and a local NGO. I left Alamance County and returned to the Randolph County Sheriff's Office as the Chief Deputy in 2018. I will testify that our agency currently lacks the manpower, training, and resources necessary to investigate human trafficking. We do recognize that while human trafficking may not be widespread in Randolph County, the potential is there, and even one trafficking victim in our community is worth the effort to prepare our agency for these investigations. Human trafficking takes many forms and does not discriminate. Every case is different from the next. Our most vulnerable citizens are being victimized in our communities in plain sight. These victims commonly come from backgrounds of poverty, domestic abuse, substance abuse, family dysfunction, or simple misfortune that have placed them in a position of vulnerability. They are targeted by predators that promise something better, often basic needs simply like a place to live. Traffickers use many different techniques to lure, coerce, or force their victims into sexual servitude, the sex trade, or labor. They are very adept at convincing victims to perform whatever acts they have chosen as long as it benefits them. Traffickers are even more skilled at holding these victims mentally hostage through emotional manipulation. Those powerful manipulations require even more powerful resources to help victims overcome their fears and/or attachments to their traffickers. NGOs are therefore a key to fighting human trafficking. These organizations must have resources, and law enforcement must partner with these organizations in order to be able to offer human trafficking victims something better than the life they are living. These organizations must be on the front end of investigations. Law enforcement cannot wait until they have a human trafficking investigation underway. It is imperative that they already have a partnership with these organizations and understand the services and resources available to victims. If they hope to convince victims to come forward, cooperate with investigations, and testify against their handlers. Community awareness is equally important. These victims are often living in plain sight among us, not just handcuffed in the basement. Unfortunately for our community, it is necessary that everyone understand that human trafficking is not simply physical captivity, but can be, and is more likely to be, more subtle mental captivity of power, control, and dependence. Our schools, businesses, churches, and other governmental offices must become partners with law enforcement so they can recognize the indicators of human trafficking and know how to report the suspicion and to whom it should be reported. It is equally important that we change the mindset of law enforcement in regards to trafficking victims. When the term human trafficking is mentioned, most people will picture a child or a young woman chained or physically restrained and locked away in a basement. In actuality, many cases are much more complex and not nearly as clear-cut. Many times, victims appear to be complicit in crimes that officers or detectives are investigating. Victims of human trafficking are many times participating in crimes of drug trafficking, prostitution, and frauds. Those victims who are being coerced or deceived into participating are usually unlikely to cooperate with detectives and even less likely to identify as a victim. They either fear their trafficker, trust their trafficker, or rely on them for their most basic needs or to provide for their addiction. In some cases, the trafficker is a romantic partner and even a parent. These cases often end with the victim being charged for the crime and never even recognized as a victim. In cases where victims are identified, the likelihood of the victim being cooperative and testifying against their trafficker is slim. Human trafficking cases are complex. These cases involve what we classify in law enforcement as a special victim investigation. However, they also require the resources and longevity of a vice narcotic style investigation involving tremendous amounts of manpower and sometimes months of investigation. These cases generally involve technology that requires yet another skill set to properly investigate. In addition, human trafficking does not operate solely within jurisdiction. Victims are moved or operated from county to county, across state lines, and into other countries. Most counties and municipalities in North Carolina simply do not have the manpower and resources to properly and completely investigate these cases. Agencies are often overwhelmed with obvious crimes and focused on the current opioid epidemic. It is therefore imperative that human trafficking be investigated from a task force perspective and include partners from local, state, and federal agencies, but also include prosecutors, NGOs, and other service agencies like the Department of Social Services. Local agencies cannot investigate these cases alone. The first step an agency must take in recognizing that although human trafficking may not be a widespread problem in their jurisdiction, even one trafficking victim is too many. We must make training and education a priority and initiate those necessary partnerships so we know and understand the complexities of investigations, can recognize the indicators of human trafficking, and can be prepared to properly, skillfully, and effectively interact with victims and have services and resources in place to offer them. It takes a team to bring these cases to fruition. If agencies hope to combat human trafficking in their jurisdictions, they must have the support of lawmakers and resources of our state and federal government. The Randolph County Sheriff's Office is therefore seeking a task force position with the Department of Homeland Security in an effort to initiate a partnership to combat human trafficking in our community. On behalf of my agency and potential victims in our county, I thank you all for your willingness to listen, to develop laws to protect victims, and allocate funding to assist agencies like ours in this important crime-fighting endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel. I thank all the witnesses for their testimony. I'll remind the subcommittee that we each have 5 minutes to question the panel, but I'm sure we can go beyond that. And I now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from North Carolina, hometown hero, Mr. Walker, for questions.
Thank you, Chairman Rose. I think I'll start my line of questioning this way. Of all the human trafficking training you have taken, and this is for all of you, and if we can keep our answers brief, we'll get a few more of the questions in. All the training you've taken, whether that's government-sponsored or otherwise, including NGOs, and just for people's listening perspective, NGO is basically a non-government organization. What have you found to be the most valuable? Ms. Long, let me start with you. Of all the training that you've taken, is there something that stands out, said this is something that's really working?
Thank you, Congressman Walker. No, and I think back to the probably a little over 10 years in working in this area. There are so many trainings that I can think of. Initially, I received a lot of training from internally at the Salvation Army and with some of the different materials they had developed early on to address human trafficking throughout the nation. And then, I think even I just went last week to the Shared Hope International training in Cincinnati. And even when I learned so much there, even all these years later.
So is it fair to say that some of the great training is coming from the nonprofits, from the NGOs that are partnering with this? Is that fair to say?
Definitely.
All right, Mr. Martinez, same question to you. What's something out there? I guess my question is I want people to know what are some of the things that are productive when it comes to the training side.
Well, training with HSI, we, as you know, we participate in about 120 task forces. And within those task forces, we provide training to state and federal and local agencies. Participating agencies also have access to our advanced human trafficking training that we conduct at our Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia. But this has always changed. It's an evolving crime. So HSI is always trying to modify and change our training to fit how we do today.
Thank you, Mr. Wall.
Identify just one single training, but any training opportunity in which there is a survivor. I have found in traveling across the East Coast and doing these training events, for law enforcement to understand exactly what we're dealing with would be to have a survivor, a former victim, in front of them explaining their situation and how it was that they got into it, how they got out of it, and what their mindset was while in it.
Okay. Ms. Hazelton, Colonel.
I cannot think of one particular training, but there are two components to the training that I've been to that were most impactful. The first type of training is one that is a multidisciplinary team training, which involves the NGO, the prosecutor, the other members of the task force that you're on, or the people that you're working with. It gets everybody on the same page with these investigations. The second component is training that is victim-centered, that talks about victims and how to help us understand, change our mindset about victims, and learn the techniques that we need to build the rapport with them.
Okay, thank you. Given and Mr. Wall, I'll direct this one to you. Given the interstate, and international nature of human trafficking, many cases cross multiple jurisdictions. How does law enforcement across the state deconflict and coordinate cases? Maybe Mr. Wall, Mr. Martinez, for you guys. Good.
Right now, with our partnership with HSI and with the FBI, anytime we've got a human trafficking case in the state of North Carolina that could cross boundaries for us in a county situation, we make sure we coordinate with our federal partners. We immediately call our local partners, and right now it's just deconfliction by person and by constant communication.
Right. Mr. Martinez, anything to add to that?
The same thing, and we have a headquarters component that does it on a national basis, so we contact.
And you feel like those communications are getting better as far as back and forth, and not the silo operation where we had years ago, back and forth. You feel like there are improvements?
Yes, sir. There is.
Yes, sir. I think in this type of crime element, unlike in a narcotics division where you would have silos, I think the understanding is, and everybody is sharing the information very well.
As a former pastor, and seeing some of this stuff from the distance, there's a psychological component to this as well, an emotional component. My wife helped launch the sexual assault nurse examiner program at Wake Forest Baptist Medical Center and has testified on behalf of the FBI in some of these cases here. My question is law enforcement or these state agencies, is there an equipping going on to handle the sensitivity of these issues? Colonel Hazelton just talked about some of the, not even knowing you're a victim in some of this. So certainly there's a criminal aspect to it, and we can talk about raising the penalty levels for the Johns and things. But my part of it is there someone to bridge the gap, to hold the hand of these victims, to be able to walk them through, to be able to get the information in a sensitive way that does not create more pressure or more hardships for them. Ms. Long, would you mind addressing that, and maybe Colonel Hazelton as well?
Sure, I think we are making progress in that area as well. A lot of the training that's conducted across the state and the symposiums we've conducted have included a lot of detail on trauma-informed services, trauma-informed investigations, and victim-centered services. And so I do think we are making progress. We still have much to do.
All right. Ms. Edgeland, do you have anything to add to that?
In smaller or more rural communities like Randolph County, we're still emerging on our victim services, and that's for our child advocacy centers, our sexual assault centers. we do not have those resources. I think that we're on the brink of developing those resources through our Family Crisis Center, but we're not fully developed. The NGOs, such as Alamance for Freedom, like Alamance County has, those are imperative to these investigations because those agencies provide that service to the victims.
I just don't know that people fully understand the complexity of this crime, where you can have somebody that's part of the crime but still a victim of the crime. And I'm hoping that we can dial this down to it. And I'd appreciate the chairman's yielding. I want one more question. I would like to acknowledge, I believe Sheriff Rogers is here as well today of Guilford County. Thank you for your interest today. As well, we've got some commissioners, Kay Cashin, Commissioner Jeff Phillips, Commissioner Alan Branson. Thank you for being here today. Panel, what are the most common ways your agencies become aware of a human trafficking case? Let's bring it all the way back down to there. Does the majority of cases develop through tips from the national hotline that we talked about, or is there some other way that you're getting information on this? And just quickly for the four of you, then I'm going to yield back to the chairman. Ms. Long.
Sure, thank you. You know, I do think we talk often about the National Human Trafficking Hotline and how wonderful it is and their stats are. But when you talk with the providers on the ground, they are receiving the majority of their referrals from others in their community that they've trained. And so law enforcement working with them, local coalitions, task forces, homeless shelters they may have trained. And so it does seem that that piece of raising awareness and is a bigger piece than the hotline.
Mr. Martinez?
Certainly, the hotline does provide a lot of tips, but also working with our partners, working other investigations like gang investigations, narcotics, certainly comes from that. So we do see it through that.
Mr. Wall.
Yes, sir. We would see it from proactive investigations in which we would conduct an outreach operation. We develop a lot of cases from that, as well as our partners, the NGOs, who are already servicing a victim, and they come forward and are ready to move forward with a prosecutorial case.
Colonel?
During my time in Alamance County, we did get tips from the community, and I attribute that to Alamance for Freedom and Sheriff Johnson and some of our partners there did a really good job of awareness in our community. So we did have tips coming in from the community. In Randolph, where it's not so much a hot topic item, detectives are recognizing the elements of those crimes in crimes that they are currently investigating.
You mentioned an Alamance for Freedom. Is that a group that you worked with directly when you were in Alamance County?
It was the NGO in Alamance that provided victim advocacy and services, emergency services to the victims that we encountered.
And you had a close relationship in working with them?
Yes, they were with us at almost every training that we went to, provided training. They were always there for our victim in emergency situations, which was incredible. They would actually be there when we first encountered them, provide emergency services at the time, placement, and would carry them through with finding a place to go and learn those life skills. And we actually have a very inspiring case that I hope to share soon when that case is finished in court.
Thank you, Colonel. Chairman?
Thank you, Ranking Member Walker. So I want to just first off touch on the piece of the internet. I believe, Mr. Wall, you had mentioned this statistic of 400,000 advertisements, which I find to be an incredibly striking number. So could each of you walk me through what you're seeing happening on the internet right now in regards to this issue? And then just as importantly, what have your interactions been with these tech companies, social media companies, and otherwise, to work with them to both investigate these cases using these advertisements as leads and to get these advertisements off of their platforms? So we'll start from reverse order. Colonel? I understand if there has not been any direct communication with them as well, that we find to be more often the case than otherwise.
During the time I was focusing on human trafficking investigations in Alamance County, I didn't have a lot of interaction with the actual companies in submitting search warrants to certain companies. Sometimes they didn't even respond.
Could you just go into which companies would?
So there was a particular case where I sent in a subpoena to Google for a Google account, and they never responded. That case I ended up turning over to the task force with HSI, and I think they ended up following up on that, but I waited months and months and months with no response to that
So
particular
you sent a
search
subpoena
warrant.
to Google regarding a human trafficking case that was actively occurring, and Google didn't even take the time to respond to you.
That's how it appeared.
That's astounding. All right.
Oh, yes, sir. In dealing with some of these companies, it just depends on who they are. Most of these websites are now housed outside the U.S. jurisdiction. They're in foreign countries. So that's where their servers sit, which is why there's not a lot that we can do as far as law enforcement. But as far as our interaction with them, depending on who they are, some of them have been very cooperative. They'll send us everything because they don't want the heat of law enforcement on them in not responding. So they'll give us anything we need as far as the subpoenas. But what we're seeing online, that's basically how these operations are working.
So you're telling me that there are online marketplaces, for all intents and purposes, that
Absolutely.
are operated with servers offline, but name some of these companies then.
Skip the Games, Adult Search, City X Guide, One Back Page, Mega Personals. There are over 40 that you could go to right now, and we can pull up, and you could find anything you wanted.
Okay, we'd appreciate if you could just provide us with a list of any of these that you're aware of.
Sure.
Mr. Martinez?
Same. As you heard in my opening testimony, the Muslim case utilized the internet to get his victims and people that they serviced. So the internet provides anonymity. I mean, they're always using that platform to get their victims and sell their product. So that's one thing that, and with my colleagues, with issues with getting this information from the tech companies, that's something that whenever we have issues, our cybercrime center in headquarters is always providing assistance in getting that type of support.
Undoubtedly, we've seen the cases of human trafficking dramatically increase over the last 5 to 10 years. Do we think in part that is due to these companies that are established in these online marketplaces?
I would say it could be part of it. I mean, human trafficking is such a clandestine crime where every day everything is evolving, when we're developing new techniques to uncover it. So that could be part of it, yes.
Sure. Ms. Long?
The only thing that I would add to that is that we do know also that apps are used as recruitment, and we've seen cases that used Facebook to recruit and help groom victims. And of course, now it's moving away from Facebook. But we do hear of cases with Instagram and others. Now, the commission hasn't had any, direct contact with companies.
So when you talk about apps, we're specifically referring to the social media platforms, or are there apps that are dedicated to this type of heinous activity?
I would have to defer. I know the social media platform for sure for recruiting and help and coercing victims, but do you know of any specific apps that are? Yeah, I don't either.
Okay.
No.
All right. Frank, member, we can continue with your. Sure. All right. Great. I defer to you again, sir.
Thank you, Chairman. My condolences go out to the families and friends of the 39 victims found dead last week. Some of you may have seen that in the trailer of a truck in Essex over in the UK. Well, this is obviously out of our jurisdiction. This is unfortunately an all too familiar situation, as there are countless stories of victims, sometimes in the hundreds, being discovered in the back of a trailer in terrible conditions in the United States. What would be beneficial to law enforcement officers and agencies to be able to better identify and save these victims trapped in these trailers before it comes to the tragic situation that we experienced in England? We've seen some of that here throughout the country, Mr. Wall, let me start with you, and that is there some things there that would be beneficial to law enforcement to be able to identify before it gets to that place?
Well, of course, and we're working in conjunction with Texas DPS to train our North Carolina State Highway Patrol to identify any vehicles that may be driving up and down the highways such as that. But it's just getting the word out to the communities, to the law enforcement community and to the public as to what human trafficking may look like. And I feel like once they see something, they'll say something, and then we can move forward with it.
Mr. Martinez, do you believe that some of our immigrant communities are targeted based on the fear? Sometimes you hear this about deportation that makes them even less willing to come clear on this. Is this something that you have seen or experienced? Somebody want to address that? I'll start with you, Mr. Martinez.
That's absolutely a problem. Illegal immigrants that are here in the United States are vulnerable, and they are being used in trafficking cases because traffickers take advantage of that. They know that if they're being reported to ICE or to officials, that they're going to be deported. So that is definitely.
I believe last year you guys made close to 1,600 arrests. I believe my numbers are correct on ICE, including ICE and HSI, specifically this human trafficking. Are those numbers correct? As far as you know?
The specific numbers, criminal arrests for fiscal year 18 was close to 1,588.
No. We know that the human smuggling and the human trafficking, specifically at our southern border, is a growing issue. The immigrants have been tracked from over 60 countries there. And for many of those victims that are paying these coyotes, that payment does not end once they smuggle them inside the border. Have you guys seen this continued abuse once they cross over into this country where these gang-related are continuing to reap payment, as horrible as that sounds? Is that something that you've seen that's continued once they arrive here?
That's correct, sir. And the payments never end, and that's the problem they hold over them. They never end. They're always having to pay that payment, and that's the abuse.
Let me stay with you, Mr. Martinez. I want to focus a little more on how each of your agencies and organizations specifically to work just to combat this entire problem. Does HSI have any human trafficking task forces in North Carolina?
Correct. We have one in Charlotte, one in Winston-Salem, and one in Raleigh.
All right. So if that's the case, how do you determine which local law enforcement partners are selected as task force officers, and how does the TFO relationship work to target specifically human trafficking?
Those relationships or those task force officers that come into to work with us are through dialogue, and that's through day-to-day interactions with either drug smuggling, crimes, gangs, anything, human trafficking. So it's dialogue with myself as an executive, going to the different departments and having dialogue with executives and building coalitions so we can have those exchange of resources to better combat human trafficking.
Okay. Mr. Wall, how many rapid response teams currently exist across the state of North Carolina, and how many do you think are needed?
Currently, I think there are, Christine, help me out, 24 or 44. They're in different pockets, rapid response teams, which are mostly comprised. Can
you unpack that rapid response for the listener today? What does that look like?
A rapid response team or a multidiscipline team is usually made up of NGOs, non-governmental organizations that are there as service providers when law enforcement encounters a human trafficking victim. It's someone that we rely on to call upon to come to the scene to help rescue that victim, to get them into, whether it's get them to some food, to housing, to get them out of that situation. North Carolina is not completely covered. I don't know if that number's correct as far as 24, but they're across the state, but we have a lot of counties that are still uncovered with a rapid response team.
So you believe these NGOs are valuable providers or partners with you? Could you do your job without them? Let me just be that point blank.
No. Could not do. This crime of human trafficking could not be investigated by law enforcement alone. We must have the partners of the NGOs to do this job.
On the rapid response teams, what's the biggest hurdle to establishing these teams?
I think
Ms. Long, I want you, Mr. Wall, and then we'll come back to Ms. Long.
I think it's education. I think it's getting a community to understand what human trafficking is, and then finding that passionate person or people within that community that want to stand up a rapid response team and make a difference in their community.
Ms. Long, you want to add anything to that?
Sure, I would actually. So we've counted about 24 that are either rapid response teams or maybe they're a task force or a coalition that some of them are not not always focused on 24/7 response with the national hotline. So as far as rapid response teams, there's probably around 11 or 12 of those. And I think part of the most difficult challenge that they face is that these are groups coming together on their time to try to pull together different efforts and organizations. And so I still think to some extent having that statewide task force or the unit that Special Agent Wall is talking about is needed to help just organize and add that extra additional support into them, because they are doing it as collateral sort
A couple
of.
more questions, then I'll yield back. Ms. Long, I want to stay with you here. How does the Human Trafficking Commission partner with the DHS Blue Campaign?
Yes, we were looking at having the Blue Campaign come about a year ago. We were planning an event to have them come and do a roundtable, and then due to various budget-related items, we had to postpone that. And then we do have material from the Blue Campaign that we use and take with us different places, tip cards, that sort of thing.
Ms. Martinez, my final question is, do you know if there is a Homeland Security Information Network portal for human trafficking? And if there is, do you think such a portal code could be helpful in sharing information on human trafficking? Or is there a different system that you would recommend to use to reach other law enforcement entities about human trafficking trends, best practices, and cases?
Yes. Thank you for your question. That we do. We call the HISN, Homeland Security Information.
Can you repeat that? Called the
HISN.
Okay.
It's through fusion centers that have communication across the country and able to share strategies and information through that system. Headquarters also has our headquarters human trafficking unit has a way to get information out to any of the different offices that we have across the country and share that information that way through our state and local partners through all across the country.
Thank you. Chairman?
Thank you, sir. I want to touch on big business for a moment here. We'll start with Ms. Long, and we'll just go on down. Do we have a sense that big business is complicit in this, that they're aware that potentially some of their labor is coming from this? If not, then what actors in the private sector, what can we be looking to the private sector for here as a partner? Because certainly there is some demand here that is being met. So we have to look at supply, but how can we look at demand? Ms. Long.
I do think to some extent, some big business is aware. Some of the efforts that we've taken to try to help educate and bring awareness is at our last symposium in 2019, we had a couple of specific workshops on financial crimes investigations related to human trafficking. And we had several banks come, a bank helped sponsor some of that to help kind of, just further that knowledge and how they can help with investigations. And then on even a state government platform, I guess, with our Department of Labor, with their housing inspectors that go out and different initiatives that go out, they definitely speak as well. They're looking for things and talk with growers and others in the community about human trafficking as well.
Yes, as for Homeland Security investigations, we're starting a new initiative. It's called the STOP Initiative, and that's the Strategic Trafficking Outreach Program, where we're focusing on industries to inform them, like example is the transportation industry, airlines and buses, and to make that information available to them because we feel, I think, being that this is everywhere, transportation is a key component to that, and they need to have that information, and they're more than willing to assist.
Yes, sir. I do believe that big business is probably involved in it, but their awareness of it is probably not. They're not as complicit as you may think. One of the things that I have seen in my travels, the city of Houston's doing a great job in stopping the trafficking within their city by education. So they have put in mandates that say every bus, every cab, every hotel worker, every restaurant worker within that community has to have some sort of human trafficking education, as well as any private business that's doing any business with the city of Houston must sign a contract with them saying that if they have knowledge of any human trafficking within their labor force, that their contract can be null and void. That's just one small example of how, a small, well, it's not a small community, but a community can, get the word out and make sure that those businesses are not complicit at all.
I think that's just another component to these investigations is community awareness, whether it be through big business, small business. Our community has to be aware of what trafficking looks like and who to report it to.
So one more question. I may be a New Yorker, but I am humble. So what, if anything, do you think are some lessons that North Carolina can teach other states and other localities throughout the country?
I think we just have a lot to learn. I don't know that there's anything that we can teach anyone else. I think we have to learn from each other. I think everybody has an experience and knowledge and training that can help each other. We can all work together to make these investigations better.
Great.
Yes, sir. I feel like North Carolina at this point, we're a little behind a lot of the other states that have established this and understood what human trafficking is and standing up task forces and really getting together and pushing forward. We're at the ground level. So as far as teaching anybody anything, I don't think we're quite there yet. We're still in the learning mode. But we are moving forward and we're pushing as hard as we can.
And coming new into North Carolina, I've seen from other places across the country, is that even this panel, you can hear the passion and the dedication to this horrible crime. You see it in our panel, and you can only imagine on the agent level on what they do. Sure. I see it. I've seen it everywhere. So it's my priority to develop great partnerships here in the state of North Carolina.
Thank you. I don't know that I have much to add to that. I agree that we're still in a learning mode, and working together is kind of how we're making our way through it. So,
well, I'm certainly noticing the cultural distinctions between New Yorkers and the South. You are don't do yourselves justice. I think it's I'm extraordinarily impressed by the great work that you're doing, and I do thank you for giving me the opportunity to learn from you. Sir?
Just a couple questions left, Chairman, if I could, please. I want to try to figure out, are we? I know education is an issue here, but how are we reporting these cases? How are these victims know to make sure this is the number, this is the place? And I know there's a national hotline. My question is it the most effective way for law enforcement to get tips on human trafficking cases? Mr. Martinez.
You asked earlier, what are we doing for the victims once the investigation is developed? HSI has the victim assistance specialists that we go into any investigation, and they take the victims and start the process of stabilization for the victims. So our victim assistance specialists are constantly doing education. They're out doing trainings, and they're having these contacts with the NGOs. And that relationship with the NGOs is an important step, as my colleague said earlier. Without them, we can't do what we do. So if there's that relationship with our victim assistance specialists and with our special agents, we're able to get more tips and more victims to come forward with that.
Okay. Somebody else want to address that?
Yes, sir. I think it comes back to the relationships with law enforcement, with the service providers. Yes, the Polaris Project and the 1-800 number is a great tool, but a lot of these service providers are going to see these victims on the ground level probably before somebody calls that 1-800 number. And knowing that a service provider has a law enforcement officer or agency to lean upon and directly call that will serve them properly, I think you'll see the numbers start to tick up.
Ms. Long, if there's a 12 or 13-year-old young girl, young boy out there that showed up for school that has been a victim of this, how do they find out where they go to make sure that their anonymity is protected, but also because these deviant human beings have instilled in their mind that if they say anything, well, first of all, they've instilled that they're the victim, that they deserve this. Number two is if they do something, if they haven't already created an addiction problem for them already, they have put them in fear of their life. How does that person get that information to you? Whatever the environment from our schools or hospitals, how do they approach, how do they get this information to the pipeline?
Could be, yeah, a few different ways, actually. So we do have a law in North Carolina where particularly middle schoolers are supposed to be educated on sex trafficking. And so we have a little bit more to develop with that as far as recommending specific materials and curriculum to be used in schools. But schools are doing this now, and the National Human Trafficking Hotline is the number being given that will then reroute them back to the closest NGO in their area providing services. Of course, if they are a minor as well, then Child Protective Services would be involved. Hospitals as well. Atrium Healthcare out of Charlotte has launched an initiative with a toolkit and a 3-staff team that is kind of providing their own rapid response team within the hospital system. They've presented to a committee of ours recently and said they had seen about 127 referrals since March when they began. And so their model seems to be working well, and we're looking forward to seeing how it continues.
Mr. Wall, in your experience, the Johns, for lack of a better expression, who I think are abusers in this process as much as anybody, are the penalties stiff enough for these guys
No,
and
sir.
gals?
Not at all. No, if we do a proactive operation, which we do, an outreach operation for the females, and then one to bring in the males as far as the John cases, as you refer to, that's going to be a misdemeanor. They're going to get a ticket, and they're going to walk away.
So let me get this straight. So you've got the trafficker, you have the victim, and you have the Johns.
That's correct.
In some cases, the victim may end up getting a longer punishment or penalty through the justice system than the actual John. Is that
correct.
Is that not just ludicrous?
Yes, sir. 100%.
Think about that. Mr. Martinez, anything you want to weigh in on that in your time? And would you agree with Mr. Wall as far as the Johns come out of this in a way, a much less way that they should be when it comes to the penalty and the punishment?
Oh, absolutely. And victims are scarred for life. It's something they carry with them forever. So that has no comparison. I totally agree.
And just let me keep pushing on this. Help me understand this, because I want to make sure we've got this. Do the Johns know when they go to these places or portals or sites that the victims they're encountering, whether it be young men or young women, do they know these people are being trafficked?
It's my opinion. Again, back to my statement, I think they have to know. I think deep down they don't want to believe that, and they want to think that this person is here of their free will, since they're calling him and they meet him alone. But a rational human being, even though he's trying to buy sex, has got to think, is this really what this person has chosen to do? Did she walk in this room freely, or he walk in this room freely at their own free will in choosing to do this?
What creates a spike in this in our communities? What is it that you see that drives this at different seasons, different times? What is it that drives a spike into this?
I think it's seasons, it's events, it's
like sporting events and things?
Absolutely. You got sporting events. We just had the state fair, the furniture market here in North Carolina, the NBA All-Star that we had. When you see the Super Bowl, there's always a spike. So anywhere you have a large contingent of predominantly male individuals with excess money in a combined location away from home, I think you're going to see a spiked increase.
Going back to the earlier question, if you believe there were stricter enforcement penalties and punishment on these Johns, do you think that would help deter some of these crimes?
I do think so. And I have, just last week, we learned about some states who are changing those penalties and are making maybe the second offense a felony, the first a misdemeanor, the second a felony. And so that is something we're very interested in our legislative committee looking into.
Well, as a wrap up here today, I know the Department of Homeland Security Blue Campaign that conducts education outreach on human trafficking. They have sent us some samples their materials there on the front desk, if that is helpful to any of your organizations. Let me say thank you to the panel. I can tell the emotion that as difficult as this is, that you are still moved, and that speaks to me. Also like to thank all the NGOs that are present. I know we're on a federal witness hearing here, but let me say I view that as a ministry and a calling. Thank you to other local law enforcement or Gifford County commissioners, and then to also Chairman Rose, who was with California to New York to North Carolina yesterday, and getting in Raleigh about midnight and driving over and coming to our home state. North Carolina is proud to have you here, and we thank you for your time and your concern in allowing us to have this hearing here in North Carolina.
Thank you, sir. And, in this era of extraordinary hyper-partisanship, it is an honor to work with you each and every day. So with that, I do thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. One thing I could think of is that subpoena you mentioned. Without objection, the committee record shall be kept open for 10 days. Hearing no further business, the subcommittee stands adjourned.